feel nice and cool as we're going through our slides. So I'm now going to move on to slide 4. And this just gives an overview of what we're going to be doing today. And we're going to focus on why speech, language and communication is really important for children's overall development. And we're also going to look at the typical ways in which children develop their speech, language and communication skills. Then moving on to slide 5, here's some learning outcomes. So by the end, I'm hoping if you don't already, you'll understand the terms speech, language, communication and speech, language and communication needs. We're going to look at some ways in which speech, language and communication skills support other areas of children's development. We're going to share some factors which may be risks for children developing speech, language and communication needs. We're going to share some awareness of how they develop these skills, and we're also going to mention how this relates to children who are learning more than one language. We're also going to talk about the typical speech, language and communication development with reference to lots of resources. We only have an hour, so we're not going to be able to go through everything in masses of detail, but there are lots and lots of resources which can help you find out more information similar to that I'm sharing today. I'm now going to move on to slide 6. Okay, so I'm not aware how many of you have learnt this sort of content before, so I'm just going to give a brief overview of the terms speech, language and communication. And obviously they work together, but we're going to separate them out first and also highlight that these work in a kind of circular way, so that although it's going to kind of look like a flow chart, actually we kind of go back to the beginning and integrate all these skills together. So part of speech, language and communication is that we need to hear, attend and listen. The next slide adds another layer on, and we put together what we hear and therefore hopefully understand. And in terms of what we're then going to do if we want to say something, we plan and organise what we'll say. We're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail in a moment. Moving on to the next slide, which should be, I think, slide number 8. So when we've planned and organised what it is we want to say, we're going to use those words to share meaning, which in lots of areas might be called expressive language. Throughout this talk, we're going to talk about talking in terms of that's the phrase that we're going to be using today. Then moving on to slide number 9, we've talked a little bit about the language element there, and now we're just going to think very briefly about the communication bit. Essentially, language is all around interacting socially with other people. So the ways in which we use our language to interact with other people, we term communication. And it's really important, moving on to the next slide, that we are aware that in order to communicate, not only do we have to have the skills at our disposal, but we have to want to communicate. There has to be a need and a purpose to sharing what we want to share, and we also have confidence. So for some children, they may actually have all of these speech language skills really, really well sorted, but actually they may not be confident in their communication, or they may not want, or there may not be enough space or purpose for them to communicate effectively. And then moving on to slide number 11, the kind of last piece in the puzzle, I guess, is around using sounds to form. So basically that's a really quick overview around the terms speech, language and communication. Sometimes it's quite important to separate these out because, particularly if we're identifying how well children are doing in these areas, it can be difficult if we look at them as a whole, and particularly for children who are struggling, they may not be struggling in all of those areas. So it's really important that as practitioners we're all really clear about what those terms mean, so that we can talk most effectively about the challenges that children may be having, or actually the skills that children have got along the way. So I'm now going to move on to slide 12, and we're just going to talk in a little bit more detail about each of those areas in particular. So speech, as we've mentioned, talks about the sounds we use for talking. it's actually, in some respects, although it's the most visible thing that we notice about children's speech, language and communication, it's actually kind of quite a small bit in that it really is talking predominantly about the sounds that children use. On top of that, it also includes factors like fluency, volume, so how loud or quietly children talk, the intonation and stress that children use on different words, or that we all use on different words, and pitch, whether we're too high or too low or just right in the middle. So all of can be termed speech. Now, one of the things that's particularly important for speech in relation to children getting ready for school is that at the moment, pretty much all children are taught to read using a phonic system. And it's really important to be aware that phonics is based on essentially speech skills. And there can be lots of challenges for children who are really struggling with their speech when the way of teaching them to read is actually based on that kind of phonic system. So if you're working with children in terms of kind of school readiness and they have speech difficulties, or if you're in that kind of role with children who are already at school, a bit aware of. And it might be that actually children might have their kind of speech essentially has resolved, but actually the way they store their sounds internally isn't quite firm enough to be able to support them to use their phonics most effectively. At this point, if I was kind of delivering this to you in a real room, I would probably check to make sure that that's making sense, but I don't have a facility to do that, and it's really, really, really weird. So anyway, here we go to slide 13. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about language, and it's really obvious, but we need to clearly separate out that language has two very separate components. One is about understanding, and one is about talking. And in terms of children's development, children understand before they talk. I'm sure that's a familiar concept to many of you, but it's really, really important to not overlook how well children are understanding what's said to them, focus on what they're saying along the way. But in terms of both understanding and talking, the same sort of features appear. So children have to know and understand and have words. It sounds really obvious, but those words, their vocabulary is the building blocks of kind of putting a meaningful talk together and understanding what people are saying to them. The next thing to think about is that there are very clear rules about how words go together, which words come first, what has to come next. If you change the order around, sometimes it means a question and sometimes it's a statement. So children's language is very kind of rule-bound around where words go and the order that they have to go in, and that can be quite a complex thing for children to learn how to do. Grammar, again, the fact that if you put ed on the end of a word, then often it's in the past. Those sorts of grammatical things are all part of language, both in terms of understanding them and in terms of using them as well. The next is all about something called narrative, storytelling, but not just stories, I guess. So it's really the conversations that we have that have a beginning, a middle and an end of some description. You know, tell me about your day, what did you do? Let's listen to the story about Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, or talk to me about that science experiment that you're doing. It's about how children put ideas together in a meaningful order, essentially with a beginning, a middle and an end. And those narrative skills are really, really important for children to be able to develop. There's some evidence which shows that vocabulary, which we mentioned right at the beginning, and narrative skill are really strong predictors of how well children will do academically at school. Not how well they write, not how well they read, but actually those vocabulary skills and those narrative skills are really, really important. And then going forward, both in terms of understanding and use, we use our language to problem solve, to make inference, read between the lines, I guess. to use our language skills to reason, to negotiate, to all of those different things as well. So language has got a heck of a lot going on with it, and it's quite a complicated business. So I'm now going to move on to slide 14, where we're talking about communication a little bit. And I've separated these out into two main areas. One is around sort of non-verbal communication, things like body language, facial expression, gesture and signing, eye contact, those kind of extra parts which are added on to what we might be saying verbally, or actually that might kind of replace those things. And then the things around conversational skills and rules. How do you join in the conversation? How do you start off saying something to somebody? How do you know when it's time to be quiet? How do you use your language in different ways? I have spent many years working in schools, and one example from one of the boys I used to work with was that the head teacher was taking him home after an activity. This is a secondary school, and he did quite literally walk into the head teacher's office with his can of Coke, sat down at her desk and said, "All right, you ready to take me home now?" And he hadn't quite understood that you perhaps speak differently to your head teacher than you might do to your friends along the way. So communication is a really complex process, which has lots of unwritten rules, which children perhaps might be perceived to be picking up along the way, but actually children need to be supported and shown how to develop these skills as they go. Okay, so I've talked quite a lot. And again, if we were in a real room, having our eyes lollies all together, we would be doing an activity. But we can't do this, so I don't know how this is going to pan out, but I'm going to move on to slide 15. And this is just for you to take a couple of moments to have a little think about the things that I've just really whistled through ever so quickly around whether we're talking about speech, language, or communication. I'm not going to read everything out that's on the slide because hopefully you can kind of see that. And if you're hanging out with other people, maybe just have a really brief chat. And what I want you to think about is decide whether you think these things are speech, whether they are language, or whether they are communication. And I'm really just going to give you a couple of moments to have a little think about that, and then we'll have a look at what comes next. So if you print this out, don't look at the next slide, because that will kind of give it away. Yeah, I'm just going to give you a moment to have a little look at slide 15. Okay, so that was it probably felt like a really short time for you. It felt like an age for me. So I'm just going to put the next slide up, slide 16, and kind of show you how we've organised those different areas. Now, if we'd been doing this as a kind of a real-life activity, there would have probably been quite a lot of discussion, particularly around what goes in language and what goes in communication. Because as we mentioned earlier on, communication is essentially about using language. So these are sort of organised into areas, but there is a lot of overlap along the way. So that if children are able to identify that bag starts with a B, then that would be pretty much one of their speech skills. Babbling, so kind of babies are setting off on their speech journey, and pider for spider, just some examples of children's speech. We talked about grammar, I guess, so we talked about past tense a little bit. And if you add on the end or on the end when there's more than one of something to show it's plural, that would be a kind of a grammatical language feature. Asking a question, describing what they did on holiday, naming lots of animals, following a story, and the bottom one is always quite interesting around understanding figurative language, idioms, that kind of thing. So that's very much part of language, and particularly as children get older and experience different kinds of contexts, those kinds of idiomatic language happen a lot more often And actually it's quite late on in children's development that they start to kind of get a sense of what those things actually mean. So often a kind of a bit of an explanation is really good. And then in terms of communication, I've taken those out quite deliberately away from the kind of language bit. So waving goodbyes, it's communicating something, looking at the person who's talking and taking turns. They're all communication skills. So I'm hoping that that's okay along the way. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go to slide 17. Okay, so this is set out slightly differently on my handout in terms of there's kind of like a bit more like a wheel, but anyway, this is what we've got just now. So we're going to talk really briefly about how children develop their speech, language and communication skills. And I'm sure that you were all completely familiar with the notion that children don't develop these skills in a vacuum. They develop them through interacting with other people. There is a responsiveness from parents, caregivers, other adults, peers, which enables them to shape and develop their speech, language and communication skills. So that interaction based on good attachment is really clearly massively important. Developing speech, language and communication is all about being active, and the need for responsive adults who are able to kind of adapt and support children's language development and respond to it is absolutely crucial. I'm guessing that many of you are sort of early years practitioners, and you'll be familiar with the fact that children's communication skills develop right from birth. You know, as soon as they're giving a little well, so they're hungry, they're communicating their needs. Obviously, there's kind of lots of schools that thought that they're developing these skills from kind of even before that point, kind of while they're developing and listening to mum's voice and dad's voice and big sister's voice and all that kind of stuff. But it is really, really reinforcing to everybody that right from the minute that they are getting cracking, they are communicating, and that responsiveness to what they're doing through copying and mimicking and kind of game playing and sound making is really, really, really important. With the Communication Trust, we have a real strong focus on supporting people who work with children around communication development. And we have lots of anecdotal examples of people going into some early year settings and kind of there not being much going on in baby rooms in terms of children's communication. And actually practitioners saying, oh, well, there's not much point in talking to them just yet because they can't talk back. You know, I'm absolutely not saying that's always the case at all, but there have been examples where kind of that sort of thing is happening, and it is that, you know, right from the beginning, they are cracking to get on with their communication, and they need lots of stimulation and responsiveness back. I'm going to kind of leap over to the other blue box, and yes, they develop right from the beginning of when they arrive, but they continue to develop through adolescence. It's certainly in my profession as a speech and language therapist, I did very little in my training, actually 20-something years ago, around older language development. And I think still in some areas there is that kind of sense that, oh, well, they're done by about 7 or they're done by about 11. And actually, children continue to develop their communication skills, their language skills, right the way through adolescence and into adulthood. So it doesn't stop, which is kind of one of the key things that I often have to share, particularly with secondary school colleagues. And then the final point I want to draw out from here is that for each of those areas, for speech, for language and communication, there are expected patterns of development. We know pretty much what children should be doing in terms of their ages and stages for speech, for language and for communication. And that might be much more second nature to perhaps some of your professional backgrounds than, for example, it might be in schools. And we've got a really, really strong push at the Communication Trust to really make sure that there is a much stronger awareness, firstly, that children develop in a typical fashion and with expected ages and stages, and also what those ages and stages are. We don't expect everybody to commit them to memory because there are lots of resources to help them, but we are really trying to promote the need for practitioners to be really confident with knowing about the ages and stages of communication development. Firstly, so that they can promote and stimulate development even further, and secondly, so they can most effectively identify children who are struggling. Particularly in some areas of the country who are areas of social deprivation, around 50% of children are starting school with delayed language. But actually, there's lots of evidence which shows those children aren't being identified. We did a project in Manchester, and in the nursery, 50% of children who had quite significant language delays hadn't been identified by staff, partly because so many children were delayed, it was really hard to work out what you would expect from that group of children. Not sure if that makes sense. But actually, the kids who they thought were absolutely fabulously exceptional relative to a national sample were absolutely bang on average. So it's kind of having those expectations around typical development, if not in your head, but firmly by your side, is something that we're really promoting at the Communication Trust. So here's another interactive activity that's not that interactive. Just some ideas about what might be typical for 2-year-olds. Some of these are, and some of these aren't. So again, just while I have a quick drink of water, have a little look at these and decide which of these you think are typical for a 2-year-old, and which of these you think aren't. And then, again, don't look ahead if you have printed this out, and I'll come back to you in just a couple of moments. Okay, so here are some possible answers. What I forgot to mention right at the very beginning, in all my excitement, was that if you have any questions, we'll have a question session at the end of the presentation. So typically for 2-year-olds, you would hope that they're using 50 or more single words, asking lots of questions, understanding between 200 and 500 words. And if you remember what I said earlier, that understanding comes before talk, then that kind of backs that up really, really very clearly. And that's actually a lot of words for kind of a 2-year-old, but that's kind of what the evidence shows. Understands kind of simple but two-part questions around where Teddy, those sorts of things, and is making short sentences of 2 to 3 words. So that's what we would expect children to be doing at 2. And this gives us a chance that if parents are really, really worried, but actually their child is on track, it's a really good way to be able to say, well, no, look, here we go, this is clear, Bob's doing really well. Or actually, if there is cause for concern, it provides a kind of a very clear starting point to kind of take that forward a little bit. So I'm sure you're kind of very familiar with all of that kind of stuff anyway. But in case you want to find out more, I'm now going to move on to slide 20. I think I didn't say it was slide 19. Okay, so this is slide 20, and it should have a picture of one of our resources, which is called University Speaking, on it. And these are a series of booklets that we developed as part of the National Year of Communication, which was in 2011. And these are all free to download from our website, and I think there's a link at the end. And they're organised into 3 separate age groups: 0 to 5, 5 to 11, and 11 to 18. Again, reinforcing that kind of language development doesn't stop at 11. And these include information on what's typical for children's speech, for their language and their communication, by kind of year groups, essentially. It also gives information about how to check out the skills. So some little things that you can do to not test out, but just really check out whether or not they are able to do those things or not. And then some ideas about how to support speech, language and communication. There are lots of other things that are also available, kind of ages and stages, posters and those sorts of things. But University Speaking just kind of sets it out in a very kind of clear and accessible way about what to expect at different ages for children's development. As I mentioned, they are free to download, but you also are able to order some, I think, if we have in stock. And again, if you contact the Communication Trust, we can let you have those. So I'm now going to zoom on to slide 21. And this is, again, something which is not, I imagine, unfamiliar. There are two things that we really bang on about quite a lot in the Communication Trust, in addition to kind of developmental norms. One is that speech, language and communication skills are building blocks. They're the foundation on which lots of other skills sit. So in terms of learning to read, to write, to spell, they are fundamentally built on good language and communication skills. Children need to have really good speech, language and communication skills to make the most of their learning. Much of what happens in schools is based on using language both to teach and to learn. And the same in terms of children's social and emotional development and their behaviour. They really sit on a foundation of speech, language and communication skills. And one of our messages is around, we really have to invest time and energy in making sure that children's skills in speech, language and communication are a good, strong foundation. Because if they're not, then those blocks at the bottom are going to be wobbly for everything else to build on. And there are really lots and lots of evidence which shows that the impact of poor speech, language and communication skills on literacy, attainment, social development, emotional development, those impacts are really strong and can be very, very long lasting. So it's kind of just really something to bear in mind, I guess. And just some evidence bits there at the moment, particularly around the kind of early years. So really interesting research study undertaken by Sue Ralston in Bristol, which kind of uses a kind of a big cohort study, and they found that a child's language development to 2 was a strong predictor of a child's performance at primary entry. And again, another kind of piece of evidence is that by a similar age, their language development can predict their outcomes at age 26, which is quite an incredible thought, really. And then the final thing just that I kind of popped in there is that really reinforcing the need for those building block skills. Children who have poor speech, language and communication skills are up to 6 times more likely to experience reading difficulties. So our message really is we need to get those building blocks right, and we need to get them really solid for their own importance, but also because so much of what else a child does throughout their life and throughout their educational journey really needs those foundations to be super duper strong. And the other message, moving on to slide 22, is that, and this kind of looks a bit weird. So in my original presentation, this is like a wheel, and speech, language and communication is at the centre. Okay, so you just have to use your imagination a little bit with this. So if you perhaps squeeze it in somewhere in your mind, is that those skills continue to be central to children's play, their thinking, their learning, and that they continue to play a really, really important role in all of those different areas. And that's important to draw out for a couple of reasons. One is that quite often children who have difficulties with communication may not be identified. But what may happen is there may be concerns about their literacy, or their reading and their writing. There may be concerns about their behaviour. There may be concerns about their play. And actually, what's underlying that might be issues to do with speech, language and communication. So one of the things, again, that we really are kind of strongly promoting is if there are concerns about a child's behaviour or about their play or their socialisation, it's really important where we can to take a step back and say, okay, so let's check out their speech, language and communication skills. Is that something which is underlying those difficulties and because of its central role in those areas? I'm not sure if that makes sense given that the diagrams change a little bit, but it is very much that speech, language and communication skills are central to those areas, so we really need to be supporting them and extending them, but also watching out for those areas that kind of causes for concern as well. Slide 23. Again, this is just really very top-line information around how children and young people develop their skills. And we touched on this already, But again, they relate what they hear to what they see, feel, experience and know. And the important thing about this is, if a child's language skills or their experiential skills or their experiences are limited, then their ability to relate new things to what they already know is really impacted on. So really it is that sense of the more opportunities children have to kind of extend their experience and extend their understanding and their knowledge and their language, the easier it is then to further develop their language and their knowledge and their understanding. I'm not quite sure if that makes sense. I should be looking out to see puzzle faces, but it is really about children relating new things that they hear or new things that are said to them to what they already know and building from that point. Children also try their skills out. They see what happens, they see how they work, but then they get responses. If they don't get those responses, then they'll either give up trying or they'll just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, which doesn't then have capacity to kind of move on. So children develop their skills to really try things out, and somebody responding to them and them thinking, oh, that's a great idea, I'm going to do that a bit more, or I'm going to add this word in, or I'm going to extend what I'm going to say. And if they learn the skills, they practice and consolidate them, extend them and build on them, but they don't do that on their own. They do that because people are there joining in and leading that and kind of following what they're interested in and developing things along the way. So it's that very much team approach to developing communication skills. Okay, moving on to slide 24. It's really important just to think about how children and young people who are learning more than one language develop those language skills as well. So there are kind of 6 things on this slide, which I'm just going to read through, and I want you to have a little think about whether you feel that these are true or false. So skills developed by the same means, whatever the language. So that means that whether skills, the thing that I just talked about that interactiveness is the same whatever language children are learning. Into the middle, they always follow a developmental pattern, but patterns vary depending on the language, The third one, to decide if it's true or false, is bilingualism is a recognised advantage. And going downwards to the bottom left, mixing words from both languages in a sentence is a normal part of bilingual language development. It sounds a bit like when I try and talk French when I'm abroad, and I manage to start off maybe with 2 words in French and then the rest is in English. I think that's part of my bilingual language development as well, but that kind of mixing along the way. Becoming conversationally fluent in a second language usually takes around 2 years. So that's not, it happens when a child's 2, it's from whenever a child starts learning that second language. And then the final one to decide if it's true or false is that parents should be encouraged to talk to their children in whatever language they feel most comfortable. So hopefully you've had a little bit of a chance to think about which of those is true and which is false. And actually they're all true. So children develop their second, third, fourth languages in exactly the same way as their first language, through interacting with other people, through building on what they already know and developing in that way. Also children, they do follow the developmental pattern. The patterns will be different. Polish development is different to Russian development is different to English development, whatever. But there are still developmental patterns. And the reason that this is important is that a child isn't having difficulties, or that the way to spot a child who is speaking more than one language isn't just around what they're doing in English, if they're learning English as an additional language. It's actually thinking about what they're doing in their home language along the way as well. Bilingualism is a recognised advantage. That mixing, again, perfectly normal part of developing bilingually. And it does take 2 years to become conversationally fluent. The important point to draw out about that is there's lots of research which shows that the next stage of competence, if you like, around that much more sophisticated and what's called academic language, takes a lot longer. So, that has implications where children are kind of presenting as conversationally fluent, but actually they need a lot more time to develop that kind of more sophisticated kind of language approach that is often in place in schools. And it's really, really important that parents are encouraged and supported to do whatever they feel is most comfortable. And that's something, and similarly where children are in settings, it's really important for them to use the languages that they are most comfortable with. Language development itself is the most important thing. The language in which children are developing those skills is kind of almost secondary. It's that sort of development sense which is really, really important. Hopefully that's making sense. I'm starting to work slightly in my kind of very hot office, but I'm now going to move on to slide 25. We've talked a lot about children with speech, language and communication development, and I'm just going to float this term past you, which you may already be completely familiar with. It's really interesting in our sector, so in the kind of speech and language therapy world and in the education world, there's lots of differences of opinions, there's lots of differences in terminology, but at the Communication Trust we have defined speech, language and communication needs in this way. So most children follow the expected pattern of development at the expected time. Some children don't. Children who are not following the expected pattern of development at the expected time are described as having speech, language and communication needs. There are a whole range of different reasons and risk factors for this, which we're going to talk about in a little moment or two. But essentially, we know the pattern that children should be following. If they're not, then they may be described as having speech, language and communication needs. Hopefully that's all kind of making sense. Now I'm going to move on to slide 26, which is a very unhelpful looking black square. And there is a link here to a video clip, but the joys of the kind of conference call means that I can't play this. But I think the link is made available to you. And also on the Communication Trust website, there is some more footage of the children that are in this Listen to Us clip called The Way You Talk. And it's just a really interesting 5-minute clip about children talking about themselves. So I think there are 8 children between 4 and 15 who have speech, language and communication needs, and they're just talking about stuff. And it's really interesting. So if you have an opportunity to go and have a look at that at another point, kind of please do so, because it's a really interesting insight, and the little guys and gals on that are absolutely gorgeous. So it's just a very you may find you shed a tear or two, but anyway, there we go. I'm starting to waffle. Right, I'm going to move on to slide 27, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the factors relating to speech, language and communication needs. Again, this has kind of come out slightly differently, but there are lots of different factors. Starting over on the left-hand side, I mentioned already earlier that there's a really strong association with social disadvantage and speech, language and communication needs, particularly language delay. There is lots of evidence which repeatedly shows that often around 50% of children have significant language delays. Many of those aren't routinely identified, but there are lots of initiatives nationally that are trying to kind of focus on really identifying those children and really preventing that kind of language delay. There's some interesting work around the role of kind of parenting in language delay, and it's very much about what mums do in this piece of research, the support that they have, and how good they feel about it all, which makes a really big difference. So it's about how what parents do, not who they are, which fundamentally makes the kind of biggest difference. And that social disadvantage bit, whilst a lot of the evidence is really focused on early years and starting school, those patterns continue throughout school life and into secondary. So it's absolutely not the case that kids will just catch up if they have delayed language. There's some other reasons there. I'm not going to go through them all, but what I imagine a lot of you guys are kind of coming into contact with a lot more is the real significant issues that the big rise in very premature, very early babies, still essentially surviving, I guess, and the developmental impact for those children who are born very, very prematurely has often kind of profound impacts on their communication development. The other thing to kind of bear in mind is that speech language communication needs is often part of other things that are going on. So in terms of autism, things like ADHD, hearing impairment, often speech language communication needs are part of those areas as well. As well as the kind of structural and neurological things like cerebral palsy or cleft palate or those kinds of things, and learning difficulties. The really important thing to draw out from here, which isn't on the diagram, is that for some children, particularly those children who have something called a specific language impairment, where all of their other areas of development are tippity top, is that for many of those children we actually don't know. We absolutely don't know why it is that those particular children have a really specific difficulty with speech, language or communication. Okay, so lots of different factors which can relate to speech, language or communication needs. Okay, I'm now just going to move on to slide 28 and just touch on some principles around recognising children and young people. There is lots and lots of evidence which is showing that speech, language and communication needs are under-identified. So, for example, in the general population, we would expect between 5 and 7% of all children to have a specific language impairment, whatever the age. Now, for children doing GCSEs, 0.2% of them have been identified as having a specific primary speech, language and communication need. Even in primary schools, it's 2%. So we know that even for that very specific group of children, loads of them are going unidentified. And it's really our kind of mission to make sure that practitioners are equipped and confident to spot those kids. We've already said that they don't just catch up without the right support at the right time. So we need to find them, we need to kind of track them down, and we need to make sure that we can provide the right support for them, because the long-term impacts of speech, language and communication needs are wide-ranging and huge for many children. We have another 2 of these Thinking Thursdays planned, depending on how this one's gone, I guess. And the next one's going to be a lot more focusing on identification, because that's a really crucial role, particularly around the 2-year check, and some interesting kind of government plans for testing and things like that. So I'm not going to talk about that in a lot of detail, but in terms of principles for recognising children, if you understand the ages and stages, that's a really great starting place. Making sure that everybody is confident in terms of observing and recording what a child can do as well as what they find difficult. There's evidence which shows that just relying on parental reports isn't an accurate way of identifying children who are having difficulties. So whilst on that slide it says that gauging the views of the children and the parents is important, parental reporting have not been shown to be effective in identification. As I mentioned in that kind of slide that should have had language centrally, if they're having difficulties in another area of development, it's really thinking about, well, perhaps speech, language communication might be in there somewhere. There are lots of tools and resources available to help, and obviously kind of sharing about children. Okay, I'm going to move on to slide 29, and I'm kind of coming to the end of my whistle-stop tour around children's speech, language and communication development. And just signposting you to some resources. Most of our resources are free, so go and have a little look. Most of them are downloadable. So the university speaking document that I talked about, there are some posters that you can download. There's a booklet called Misunderstood, which is really interesting. The small talk booklet is actually kind of a resource that we unfortunately have to charge for now. So that's very much focused on live. And there's some kind of websites there to kind of point you in the right direction of. If you're interested in knowing a bit more and about the areas of speech language communication you want to find out more about, if you go to the speech language and communication framework, you can fill in like a self-evaluation form. I'm confident in this and I'm not confident in that, and it can signpost you to some professional development along the way. So, slide 30, what next? If you're interested in anything that I've talked about today, or you want to get in touch with the Communication Trust, there's a kind of website and an email address there. If you are interested, we have a newsletter you can sign up to just kind of find out all about the things that we're doing. We're going to be doing the Thinking Thursday, as I mentioned, about identifying children. And I'm also just going to flag to you that we have developed with City and Guilds, that's also offered by Cash, a level 3 qualification in supporting children and young people's speech, language and communication. If you want more information about that, then do get in touch via the inquiries. Moving on to slide 31, I think I'm kind of handing back over to Ethel right now in terms of the kind of CPD information. And if you have any questions, then if you're still there and you haven't wilted, then I'm very happy to answer them, but I don't quite know how that's going to work. So that's me finished. I hope I've covered.
The organizer code you entered is not valid. Please enter your organizer code. The organizer code you entered is not valid.
No.